In some ways, my talk follows on from John and Scott's talk, since it draws on the same type of resources which I use in my research into the medieval Welsh landscape. And I should start by saying that I'm a landscape archaeologist or landscape historian rather than a place names expert. And as you'll have guessed, Welsh is not my first language. However, as a landscape historian, place names are very much part of my toolbox. I'm therefore conscious of treading delicately with some of the material that I'm presenting today, especially where I venture into areas that have as yet received little specialist toponymic attention. So, as well as place names, my research toolkit includes archaeological and historical records, early maps, oral traditions, manorial records, and geophysical evidence, which I combine within GIS mapping. And I'm interested in the long-running social processes that shape life in the landscape and which are preserved in activities like rural fairs, agricultural systems, and seasonal land use, as well as place names, which are well recognised as markers of past practice and function. And today I'm going to look at how place and field names can identify medieval settlement and agricultural patterns. And after that, I'll move on to their use in identifying assembly sites, the open-air settings of legal, administrative and recreational gatherings in the pre-Norman, pre-urban period. And I'll be looking at this area, the Hydref or Lordship of Cymru in North Pembrokeshire, which encompassed the Preseli Hills and the coastal plain between Fishguard and Cardigan. Its 12th century central place was the castle of Nevern, superseded in the 13th century by the Anglo-Norman plantation town of Newport. And within it are areas called Welshries, where landholding systems based on pre-Norman Welsh law persisted until the 16th century, side by side with Anglo-Norman manors, the Englishries. And here they are. My particular interest is in the Welsh-held areas, which can help us to understand how life in the landscape was organised before the arrival of the Normans in the early 12th century. Medieval records are limited, so the surviving medieval place names are particularly important for understanding the landscape. And they're recorded in B.G. Charles's Comprehensive Survey of the Place Names of Pembrokeshire, published in 1992. This enormously valuable book lists by parish every place name that he had been able to identify. It doesn't, however, have Ordnance Survey references, so I set up an Excel database of its Cymru place names and then identified the geo-coordinates for names recorded before 1700 using 19th century Ordnance Survey and tithe maps. I excluded Newport from my research, I should add, since it was an Anglo-Norman foundation. And on the screen, you can see the result, the pre-1700 place names on top and the pre-1500 place names underneath. Most of them are on the better land, near the coast and in river valleys, and refer to land holdings around hamlets. This next slide isn't strictly speaking place name work, but it gives a bit of context. It shows the settlements in Cymru, where payments derived from pre-Norman law were still being collected in the 16th century, and ranks them by the number of land holdings within them. As you'll see, it's a landscape of many tiny hamlets, which very much fits with the picture given by medieval Welsh law. So to understand the landscape around these hamlets, I created a database of tithe schedule data linked to GIS polygons, as you just heard, of the tithe maps. Here's a taste of that mapping using selected 19th century fields and place names as a context for Tudor land holdings that paid a rent of extent of pre-conquest origin. And I'm now going to look at some of this analysis for the area outlined in red in the centre of the map. This is Bayville, a manor of the Anglo-Norman Lord of Cymru. It extends eastwards of Nevern, and although it was an Anglo-Norman manor, it is listed as a Welshry. Medieval and 16th century records show that descendants of the pre-conquest Mair or Stuart held lands here, as well as the Lord of Cymru, and that they were Welsh bondsmen. And elsewhere in Wales, these bondsmen, as unfree tenants, supported the llys or residence of a Welsh prince. And their settlements shown on this map, which also shows an area of recurrent henllys place names in the south of the manor. These are first recorded in 1338, with the hen, old or former element, indicating that it is an ex-llys by this time. Castell Henllys, the adjacent Iron Age enclosure, is recorded in 1497. The name probably refers to a llys that was once used by a Welsh prince on his circuit around his kingdom, and which went out of use when the Anglo-Norman castle at Nevin was built in the early 12th century. Bayfield's landscape was extensively reorganised in the 17th century by resident gentry families, and visualising its earlier landscape patterns is difficult because the earliest maps are late 18th century. However, field and place names often refer to older understandings of the landscape, so I looked at the patterning of these to see what it showed. And here's the map I showed you earlier, which uses select 19th century fields and place names as a context for 16th century Welsh law landholdings. And now on the right, I'm showing that analysis for Bayville, showing field and farm names with elements that are indicative of Cytir, the shared pasture that made up the outfield part of medieval Welsh infield-outfield systems. So we have moor or rough ground, the Rhos and Gwaun, uncultivated land, the Gundwn and Garw, thistles or gorse, Asgall and Eithin, and referring to techniques of occasional cultivation of portions of the outfield, we have beating and breath. And almost all of these names are found in the northern part of the manor, which is also the area where, according to documents of the 14th to 16th century, the farmsteads of the south held rights to shared pasture. And these names, in combination with medieval and 16th century records, help us identify an area of medieval shared grazing which is ringed by settlements and arable open fields. And you can also see this pattern in the place and field names of the parish of Dinas between Newport and Fishguard. This is another Welshry, but unmanorialised. And here too, the hamlets with pre-1600 place names, which relate to settlement areas, ring a central area, much of which was built on in the 19th century. We can unpick this later development using field and place names. And I'll start with the recorded common land and add land with Cytir names or described as shared or undivided. And then names like Rhos and Mynydd, the moor and hill areas that are commonly indicative of Cytir or shared pasture and sometimes used for cutting peat. Terms like Eithin and Redin, gorse and ferns, which were used as animal feed and for thatch. And there are various sorts of woodland, from helyg, willow, used for baskets, to the llwyn, where fuel might be gathered. And meadows, Clean, Dol, and the Gweilglodd, the hayfield. And the combined picture shows that pre-1600 hamlets and medieval open fields encircled an area of communal resources of different types. And the overall picture is rather like Bayville, though here we can identify that the shared pasture is divided between Rhos and Mynydd, which in the medieval period was used for pasturing cattle between May and September. And it represents the on-the-ground reality of arrangements that are given in 13th century South Wales law. Moving on, I'm now going to look at assembly sites, an aspect of the pre-Norman landscape that has received little attention in Wales, although it's the subject of a great deal of work elsewhere in Britain, Ireland and Scandinavia, and two major reviews are shown on the screen. And these are the outdoor sites where courts, fairs and other seasonal gatherings were held in the pre-urban world. They're found at different spatial and social scales, from ceremonial centres to local farmers negotiating grazing rights, at locations that include royal courts, boundaries and areas of common pasture. And being outdoor sites and occupied only for short periods, they don't leave many material remains for archaeology to identify. Place names and written records are the main means of identifying them, in combination with recurrent patterns of site elements. These site elements include mounds and barrows, specifically named areas of assembly, monumental stones, churches, burial grounds, fortified enclosures, often multivallate, sacred trees, holy wells, important routeways and river crossings. And work in other areas of Britain shows that place names may refer to gatherings of different sorts, to legal proceedings, speech or discussions, or to the name of an administrative unit, perhaps in combination with topographic or locational elements like mound or ford. And here is a 17th century Irish drawing showing the inauguration of a Gaelic chieftain and some notes about the place name elements associated with Irish inauguration sites, all of them referring to mounds or hills. Possession of these sites and their sacred trees was crucial to Irish kingship, and they tend to be located near the domain lands of chieftains or kings, with extensive views of the surrounding territory, which was symbolically married in the inauguration ritual. In Wales, place name work on these sites is represented principally by a paper by Thomas Charles Edwards, which discusses the use of the terms gorsedd and dadl for assemblies, drawing on earlier work by Ifor Williams on gorsedd place names. Unlike Ireland, where the Éanach or assembly is richly attested in early literature, Wales has few explicit references in early sources. The 11th century Life of St. David mentions a synod or ecclesiastical assembly held around 560 AD at Llanddewi Brefi. Here, the natural mound under the church is said to have miraculously risen under David's feet when he spoke. Oral traditions similarly associate certain mounds in Mid Wales with another 5th century preacher, St. Germanus or Garmon. The Llandaff Charters record meetings of elders to regulate transactions, and a law-making assembly of Hywel Dda at Tŷ Gwynarth Fawr, thought to be Whitland, is mentioned in a prologue, albeit perhaps a late insertion, to medieval Welsh law. And there's a well-known reference in the Mabinogion to a gorsedd mound, a place of royal power and visions, next to a crossroads at the llys site of Arbeth or Narberth. And there's also mention of an assembly of the men of Preseli, although the site is not specified. Customary boundary meeting places used for dispute settlement between neighbouring cantrefi or kingdoms and for musters are noted in medieval sources. There are also 16th century accounts of unofficial hillside assemblies called Cymanfoedd or Dadleuedd, where on Sundays and holidays people listened to heroic songs and recited genealogies. Traces of these are still around in the 19th century, some in the context of gatherings on August the 1st, Gwyl Awst. Taken together, these suggest long-standing traditions of gatherings with locational attributes like mounds and boundaries that are seen in other areas. I therefore took a three-pronged approach to identifying assembly sites, looking for records of gatherings, for locational attributes similar to those noted elsewhere, and for indicative place names. I'll focus on the latter today. I'll start with Bayville, which is an archaeological hotspot. Going clockwise from the top of the slide, we have an early medieval kist grave cemetery at Caer Bayville, then a Bronze Age barrow cemetery and a square-ditched grave of late or post-Roman date within a multi-valid Iron Age enclosure at Crygiau Cemais, another multi-valid Iron Age enclosure at Castell Henllys, a number of small enclosed settlements of late prehistoric to early medieval date and a large one at Dryslwyn or Pantllech, a corn drying kiln of the 5th to 6th century AD, a Neolithic chamber tomb, which I haven't shown on the slide, Leven and its Ogham stones and cross, and a large flat-topped mound of unknown origin at Pantagoes, where a medieval cross once stood. And place names add weight to this extraordinary collection of sites. I've mentioned Henllys already. There's also Crygiau Cemais, the hillocks or barrows of Cemais, a name that indicates a site with regional significance. It's first recorded in 1369 and is similar in formation to some Irish place names of barrow cemeteries associated with inauguration sites. There are also morphological similarities to these Irish sites, given its Bronze Age mounds encompassed within the banks of a multi-valid Iron Age hill fort, and the setting on a high point of land above Henllys provides further parallels. The presence of a square-ditched burial of late Roman or early medieval type, like Branwen's in the Mabinogion, shows its continuing significance. Place names indicate more assembly locations of different periods to the west of Crygiau Cemais. They fan outwards from another early medieval burial ground, this time of stone-lined kists of the 7th to 9th century, within a small oval enclosure that is known these days as Caer Bayville. Its medieval name is Caer Eglwys Mawr, Fort of the Great Church, which echoes the Great Church terminology used in 7th century Ireland to describe the conversion period Domnach churches, and perhaps links Caer Bayville with St. Brynach's Church at Nevin. Locational attributes hint at some assembly-linked significance for Caer Bayville. It sits on the edge of a low hillside, which forms a natural amphitheatre above one of the sources of the river, the Caman, where Brynach performed miracles, and at the start of a track that follows the river downstream towards Nevern Church. A deserted crossroads below this hillside is the likely site of a lost midsummer fair, recorded in a charter of 1338, and superseding Brynach's 12th century Feast of Translation, which commemorates the moving of his burial to Nevern Church. The crossroads is adjacent to a 19th century farm called Plas Marchand, the place of commerce in local dialect, presumably referring to a tradition of the fair, since it is an odd name otherwise in this very rural location. Somewhere nearby, there was also a mound, known from a 15th century name, Críoga Gwir, the mound of the heroes or the mound of truth, which is now lost. And there's another evocative name given to the land below Caer Beivil, which is Enwau, a single record written in an era without standardized spelling and therefore very uncertain. Charles offers no interpretation, but I might tentatively offer the possibility of a grove of the fort of acclamation, with Dean as hill or height of fortification, and Gwaith as the shout of an army or a host, referred to in the proclamation call of the modern Welsh Eisteddfod. More assembly-type place names are found further around the edge of the hillside, associated with the large, flattened, isolated mound of isolated origin in the area called Pembrokeshire, after a medieval cross that once stood here. This mound may once have been the meeting place of the manorial court, a meeting of which is recorded at Pembrokeshire in 1604. It lies in the medieval outfield area, used for summer grazing, and, interestingly, in the 14th century, the manorial court met only between May and September. This usage may be reflected in one of its names, Críoga Begellid, the mound of the animal herders. A similar place name formation, the hill or mound of the herdsmen or peasants, is found at Swanborough in Wiltshire at a hundredal meeting place. Its other medieval name was Críoga Erich, a name that Charles omits from his survey, although there are 4 instances between 1508 and 1517. A literal translation would be the hillock or mound of the swans, but that's a bird not often found on hillsides. So, given the other associations of this site, I wonder whether we have here a mangled reference to Lleoedd or Ireolwch, the pleas or supplications made to a court, which would make this the hillock or mound of pleas. But that may be a mangling too far. On the Nevern Valley side of the natural amphitheatre is a hilltop called Pantyllech or Pentellech, recorded from 1508 onwards and surviving in 19th century Tilly field names. Charles gives the meaning as hollow or valley by the stone, but the site is a hilltop, a pen, rather than a pant, a hollow or valley. So if the first element is indeed pen, the second element is presumably telech, which opens up a can of scholastic worms. Early medieval forms of telech place names are recorded in the Taylor Gospel and Llandaff Charters, and are usually regarded as a personal name. And indeed, the 12th century life of St. Brynach has a reference to a monk called Selich, to whom land was granted. On the other hand, Sir John Rhys speculated about a relationship between these names and the Irish term tulch, or hill or mound, which in early sources denotes a hill of assembly. And interestingly, all known instances of Telech place names lie in or close to areas of post-Roman Irish settlement in southwest Wales, and my research shows that where they can be located, they refer to elevated places. But the link between Telech and Tullach is, I understand, etymologically uncertain, so tempting as it is, we can't say that the name means hill of assembly. And then there is the Nevern place name, Nant Nifer or Nimer, as it is recorded in the 9th century AD. Charles says that its meaning is obscure, but with the term Nifer meaning a number or host, company or retinue in the royal sense, Nant Nifer can be understood as the river valley of the royal host or retinue. It's a very appropriate designation. So, the place names allow us to identify the layout of a regional central zone and gathering place with a dispersed polyfocal structure and place name indicators of assembly sites that date to the 9th century AD. And given this, One might also wonder about the Bayville place name. Charles follows George Owen in 1603 in saying that this is a Norman French name, named after a Beauville or Belleville in France. This, though, seems unlikely since it is not pronounced Beauville like Beaumaris and Bewley. It also has no alternative Welsh form, as one might expect in an intrusive Norman French name. If it's a Welsh name, the first element may be the pay or bay, country, land, territory or cantref from Latin pargus, which would fit with the area's other associations. But if so, that leaves, I am told, the question of the mutated form and of what Ville refers to, since a combination with a non-Welsh term like Ville is doubtful. More specialised attention is needed, I think. Turning to the wider landscape of Cemais, this slide lists some of the possible assembly places, place name indicators that I have identified. It includes the Bayville ones, together with other indicative names elsewhere in the cantref. A substantial number of these were mounds and are on parish or cantref boundaries. The most common place name elements were Krieg, Cnwc, Carn and Tumpath, all mound terms. Tumpath also means a mound, gathering or assembly, and is used in a Glamorgan saying about people who orate and gesticulate with much noise and little sense. There are two instances of it, both on the Cemais boundary, but no mounds survive, although there is a rather provocative motte at one location. The different types of assembly evidence, including place names, form noticeable hotspots, which are shown on the map, circled in white and purple. The purple circles denote less certain sites, like the Tumpath place name sites. The white circles are sites where a range of evidence points to an assembly site of some significance. There's a central zone of them at Bayville in the north, another to the south, and boundary sites to the southwest and east. There's a nice example of assembly place names on the southwestern boundary of the cantref, at a site where three cantrefi meet. This is Garn Turne, and the Turne element refers to the sheriff's circuit or court. This is a significant recorded assembly site. The 1326 Black Book of St. David's identifies it as a place of customary musters and processions, in terms that recall Welsh law's references to military hosting duties. 16th century estate records name it as the Three Lords Stone, a place where, we are told, the lords of the three cantrefi could hold court at the same time. The location is a hilltop on the westernmost spur of the Preseli Hills, marked by distinctive granite outcrops and a Neolithic chamber tomb. Underneath it is a church where charters are signed in the 12th century and which is dedicated to St. Dogwell, whose 31st of October festival marks the start of the Welsh law, food rent and law court period. And my last example is a bit different. It's an unofficial gathering site that survived until 150 years ago and provides an example of how long-standing traditions of outdoor gathering came to an end. Its name is evocative, Cnwc a Celwydd or Tamp of Lies, and it's a Bronze Age mound on the parish boundary between Moelgrove and St. Dogmell's. Until the mid-19th century, it was the location of recreational storytelling gatherings on Sundays, but the local vicar who records its name put a stop to that. Celwydd, I might add, could perhaps be a corruption of Culwydd, Lord as in God, given the area's early links with St. Dogmell's monastery. So, to conclude, place names can be used to identify assembly sites, and in doing so, they provide records of the social spaces of the past. They mark key points in the medieval landscape and identify the significance of natural features and of prehistoric sites. They indicate widely shared spatial grammars, and the name formations follow patterns that are similar to those found elsewhere in Britain and Ireland. We need much more work on these sites and their names, and I hope that I may have interested some of you in the topic. You'll find more information in the publications listed on the screen. And on that note, I'm going to finish. Thank you.